Welcome back to Talk to Al Jazeera. We're with Judge Goldstone, the chair of the mission that piled the report on the conduct of the war on Gaza. And what, Judge Goldstone, then, would you say are the most troubling of the findings of your report and your mission?
Well, I think the most troubling are the what we found, and it's not, I don't believe, in dispute. The destruction of the infrastructure, particularly the food infrastructure of Gaza, which can only be explained on the basis of collective punishment.
And you document quite in great detail then the destruction of poultry farms and food and water facilities, water treatment plants, and so on. That's not in any dispute, as far as you know.
No, well, you know, we saw it with our own eyes. You know, I'm telling you that that happened.
But with no, and it's at least the findings appear to suggest there was no military benefit.
That's correct. There was no military benefit at all. I think there was probably a political reason behind it, and that was presumably to make the Hamas administration unpopular. I doubt whether it's worked, and in fact the impression I got in Gaza is that it's had the opposite effect.
But I mean, it's this deliberate guidance, I suppose, that's so troubling. And you and the mission and the report suggests it stems from what's called the Dahiya doctrine of military engagement as learnt in South Lebanon. It's quite odd, actually. There's a balance between Israeli spokespeople being quite open about using this Dahiya doctrine to blur the distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, and then to call the findings that you collate outrageous. How does that balance out, do you think?
Well, again, this is unfortunate, and I think it needs Israeli leaders to have a look at these facts and examine them without this bombast and emotional reaction, simply rejecting the findings we made.
But I mean, does it strike you as odd, though, that on the one hand, the Israeli authorities are quite open that this is what they intend to do, and yet, when you, I mean, it's very odd to get.
There's a disjunction. I agree. Yeah. But you know, that's the nature of politics. You know, it's one of the advantages of being a politician is you can do that.
But in openly explaining what the Dahiya doctrine is and what this blurring of
and threatening before to use it.
Right. Isn't that self-incrimination already? Is there any need for a Goldstone report and further inquiry?
Well, you know, I think the facts needed to be put on the table. I think that's important, and I think by the same token, it was important to record the effect of on the other side of the terror caused to southern Israel.
But again, as far as from a legal perspective is concerned, if Israel openly says, yeah, this is what we are doing.
No, but it's still necessary to have a full investigation to determine individual liability for that on a basis of command responsibility or political responsibility.
But as far as like an independent prosecutor is concerned, though, hasn't Israel already opened itself up, though, to prosecution by saying, look, we will blur, we will use, and these are the words we've heard from many Israeli authorities, we will use disproportionate force against the enemy in order to achieve our objectives. Isn't that an admission that they are breaking international humanitarian law?
Well, indeed. I think that's exactly what it amounts to, and that's as our report makes clear as what happened.
But amongst that Dahiya doctrine then of disproportionate force, of setting out to blur these distinctions, there were other interesting elements in your report. The terminology of illegal combatants, for example, and it's very much from the Bush playbook of the war on terror, I suppose. Did that strike you as odd or new, and indeed the torture of illegal combatants and the use of stress positions? Did this strike you as interesting in the context of the global war on terror?
Not really. I didn't make that connection, but you know, I think it's interesting, and I think it follows from what you're saying. I found interesting today that I think the Prime Minister of Israel suggested that international humanitarian law needs to be changed.
Right. So again, so do you think then this is that? And even during the conflict, though, the Israeli government kept saying, look at this not in the context of 40, 50 years of occupation, but in the context of 9/11 and the war on terror. So then I suppose this is all about that. What do you make of that? You've talked in the past about the need for international humanitarian law, the designation of crimes against humanity as having sprung from the Holocaust and being so important. And now you have the Israeli government saying, well, we're being criticized. Perhaps we should change international humanitarian law to fit what we do. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's sad, and of course I think it's really clutching at straws, because international law cannot be changed because one party doesn't like the rules. It's much more complex than that.
But, I mean, again, is it amazing, though, that Prime Minister Netanyahu can say such a thing? I mean, what does it tell us about the sort of the modes of thinking? I mean, you know, you're a Zionist and a great believer in the state of Israel and its need and everything else, but what does it tell you, though, about the thinking, then, of the government in Israel? If when presented with findings of war crimes, they say, well, we should just change the law on war crimes.
Well, obviously, I would be critical of the government of any country that adopted that attitude. I think it's wrong, and I think it's very unfortunate, and it's very inappropriate.
But when we look at, then, I mean, and again, that seems to come from the top, then. So when we look at, and again, the report has these various horrific examples. I mean, in one case, the shooting of children at point-blank range whose family members were holding white flags. What are we supposed to think about how this happens?
Well, again, I think it reflects if the facts we've found are correct, and I certainly think we took every precaution to check and double check against other evidence. It indicates, I think, an unfortunate lack of discipline in the Israeli Defense Force.
But is it a lack of discipline, or is it actually a top-down?
Well,
is this the discipline?
You know, that's an open question. That's exactly why one needs a full investigation to see where it comes from and how this happens.
I mean, does this? I mean, how does it compare to the findings of your other tribunals that you've been involved with, Rwanda and Yugoslavia, even South Africa, and so on? How would the things that you found, and you and your mission found in Gaza, how do they compare as far as the psychology that led to war crimes and so on?
Well, I think the common element is dehumanizing the victims. I think if you don't dehumanize the victims, you can't behave in that way in respect of people. That's certainly been the lesson of my recent life, the last 20 years. War crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, discrimination, oppression generally, just can't happen without dehumanization. And that's what one needs for peace. I think certainly there's been the lesson in South Africa that there was obviously dehumanization of black South Africans for 350 years. But with good leadership, it came to an end literally overnight.
But that's the point. So now we have the leadership, though, in Israel, not only saying, well, we should change the laws to allow this sort of behavior, but we also have a growing movement around the world now saying, well, actually, South Africa may have changed, but it's Israel now that is becoming more and more of an apartheid state. As someone with the experience of South Africa that you have, what do you make of that comparison?
Well, I don't like making the comparison. I think it's unhelpful. I think it's emotional, and I think there are as many differences as there are, in fact, more differences than there are similarities. So I steer away from making the comparison between apartheid and what's happening.
I suppose it's a shorthand. I mean, even in your report, you have a section on the institutionalized discrimination faced by those in the occupied territories and indeed Arabs in Israel and so on. So I suppose it's a shorthand for that institutionalization of discrimination, and which perhaps leads inevitably to that dehumanization that you're so concerned about.
Well, I think it's the other way. I think the dehumanization results in it.
But either way, they go hand in hand.
But the one, I suppose, feeds on the other.
But I mean, doesn't that concern you then about Israel as a Zionist, as a friend of Israel?
Of course it does.
But then what's the defense then? I mean, especially when the Israeli public opinion is behind the government and indeed the assault on Gaza, and looks at this as still in a very sort of defensive manner, saying, look, we did the right thing. And
well, I wonder, it's all a question of leadership. I mean, if I can look at South Africa, white South Africans believed the fabricated stories that came out of government quarters. But once the floodgates opened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so on, people had to look at, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu calls it, had to look at the beast in the eye, and that made a difference. And I think it's unfortunate that generally that the public in Israel, I think, are closing their eyes to what's happening across the road.
But what alternative then does the international community have, other than thinking of Israel as some sort of pariah state which has no respect for international law, no respect for human rights, and is dehumanizing a large section of its population and those the territories it occupies?
Well, of course, Israel, unfortunately, isn't the only country that is in that position. I think this is one of the problems. I think from the Israeli side, it would be I think that with the work of the Human Rights Commission, for example, would have a far greater effect if it didn't treat Israel exceptionally.
Right. But of course, here's the difference: is Israel, though, does have the full backing of the United States, as opposed to the other countries, which again should be deemed or are deemed as pariah states. Without any pressure on Israel, do you expect any justice? Or we have, I mean, in the report again, there's a sense that there's no faith, perhaps, in Israeli internal investigations, and it's very difficult not to come to the conclusion, reading your report, that the Israeli responses to many of the charges are simple lies. Do you expect justice?
Well, it depends on the political will. I mean, I've got no doubt at all that if the Israeli government was prepared to set up an independent commission to investigate and to recommend prosecutions, I'm sure it could do that, and I would have confidence in such an investigation.
You would have confidence?
Oh yes, absolutely. You know, if the former judges, leading lawyers who I know, and who, if they undertook to conduct an independent investigation, I've got no doubt they would do that.
In the absence, though, of any meaningful investigation, is this a matter of universal jurisdiction? Then is it a matter for individual countries to take
that's
action?
the alternative, and you know, I hope the Israeli the Israeli is obviously aware of that. But I think that's where it's going. If they don't have a good faith internal investigation, this thing's not going to lie down and die. It's going to continue. Pressure is going to continue to mount for universal jurisdiction.
By which you mean what? That any Israeli, any leader who is connected to the Gaza conflict should think twice about travelling abroad?
Yeah, absolutely. It's happening already.
Judge Richard Goldstone, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.